everybody. Welcome to the morning show. We're coming to you today on WJOPLP Newburyport at FM 96.3 on Channel 9 and on Newburyport Community Media's YouTube channel at ncmhub.org. I'm your host, Mary Jacobsen, and I am thrilled and honored today to be able to talk to Doreen Wade. She is the founder and the president of Salem United, a nonprofit devoted to promoting the history of Negro Election Day. Although Negro Election Day has been around for a long time, this year on July 20th will mark the second year of it being an official Massachusetts state holiday, which is very exciting. Doreen, first of all, welcome to the morning show, and thank you so much for taking time to be here.
Thank you for the invitation. I've been looking forward to this.
Me too. Well, Doreen, let's start by, I'd like to ask you to talk about what was it that led you to found Salem United?
Well, in 2014, I went to what was called Black Picnic back then. And I noticed that it was just existing. There was no financial money being put into it. Nobody was managing it. And just not even the community was investing in it. So my mother, myself, and at the time, my best friend, we decided to look into preserving this. We were also kind of challenged from the city of Salem to do it. So we took the challenge up and we just put it together and decided to see what we could do to make sure that the event did not get shut down.
Yeah, well, I'm really glad you did because I had never known about Negro Election Day, and it's such a fascinating chapter of history. It's an extraordinary story, something that, we should all know about. I learned about it first. I went to a talk by Professor Cabrillo Baumgartner, who lives in Newburyport, and she mentioned it, and I thought, that's fascinating. Why don't we know about that? Well, so thank you for starting Salem United to spread the word and get it out there. Well, let's talk then about Negro Election Day. When, where, and why did Negro Election Day begin?
Okay, as I like to begin with, 35 years before the signing of the Declaration of Independence, enslaved Africans actually started the first democratic system in our country, because at that time, the colonials were under the British rule.
Yeah.
So they called it Negro Election Day, basically because in a part of Africa, it was actually called Negro land. And many of these men were captured by that land. So as we know, the first recorded Negro Election Day in the North Shore was actually held in 1741. And it was celebrated on 2 acres of land in Saugus that was owned by the Mansfield family. But after this gentleman named King Pompey got his freedom from the Mansfield family, he actually purchased that land in 1758. So Negro Election Day was started on there, but it was started before Pompey owned the land. So that was the nice thing. He actually wanted it to remain in the culture and the heritage. So he purchased the land that it was honored on.
Well, that I did not know that. That's really great that he managed to purchase the land and become a free human being. So it goes back a long way, and it was the first democratic system on, well, it wasn't United States yet, was it?
Right.
It was still the colonies.
Yes, it was part of the 13 colonies that existed. And I'm going to kind of jump around. So you might want to ask me a question. I may have already answered it, but basically what happened is it was actually started in Massachusetts, then it expanded around Massachusetts, and then it went to Rhode Island, Connecticut, New Hampshire. Those were the major places that it was held in.
So kind of expanded into what we now would call New England, the New England states, pretty much. And I think what I find remarkable and inspiring about the history of Negro Election Day is, as we were saying, the first democratic system, and it was truer to what we now think of as American ideals
Yeah.
of suffrage for all and the consent of the governed being what gives
Yes.
governments their power. And it was true to those ideals before any of who we think of now as the founders of the country ever set pen to paper in the Declaration
Yes.
of Independence or the Constitution. So it's this like fundamental expression of ideals that America, when it's at it, has not always, certainly, sadly, never been true to. But they gave early expression to these ideals, which is just remarkable and wonderful.
Well, most people, most of us, I don't care what race, creed, color, religion, sex we are always taught when we're younger that independence started with the Revolutionary War and
Yes.
in 1776. But these gentlemen, these enslaved Africans, actually had a democratic system
Yes.
while we were under the British rule. I like to say that um, white America was fighting their kings for their freedom, while enslaved Africans were working with their kings
Mhm.
for freedom. So it's really, if you look at it culturally, we, as Black people, we actually started the Democratic Party and what their values are supposed to be today.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, tell us a little bit more, Doreen, about so that the first title was king, and but I believe they're also sometimes they were called governor, the people who were elected. And so
Yes.
who got to vote? It was enslaved people. Was it also free blacks who were present in what would have been the New England colonies at the time? And what were the responsibilities of the king or the governor after they were elected?
Okay, so I'll start at the beginning. Basically, what happened is when Negro Election Day was established, they would, the first part of Negro Election Day was to actually hold debates. So they
Oh,
literally would go across their areas and they would debate. It lasted for about 2 weeks. And so what they would do after the debating was, then they would say, okay, so this person, and this person is going to run. But that first was done only by enslaved Africans of royal blood. So
oh,
most people don't understand how an enslaved African was documented as a royal. Well, when they were taking them from their lands, most of them knew they went on royal soil, and they were actually shutting down tribes. And
hmm,
these tribes had kings and princes.
hmm,
So basically, what they did is they said you could only run if you were a man of royal blood.
interesting.
However, everybody in the community, whether you were enslaved or whether you were a freeman,
Hmm.
you could actually vote.
Ah,
And part of this also was the indigenous tribes,
hmm,
because we have found in Saugus, indigenous people were actually part of Negro Election Day as well.
that's
Uh,
fascinating.
it's the dark skinned people
Yeah.
mentality. So once they agreed that they were going to run, whoever was going to run would stand in a line side by side. And then the community would come, stand behind these people. And whoever had the most people would win, much like our government system today,
Yeah.
except for we also go by the electoral count as
Yeah.
well. But just imagine this system was done without the electoral count.
Right.
So whoever had the highest votes would actually be the person that was elected. Then what would happen is they had a choice. They could be called a black king or a black governor. Many of them, because of the land and the location they came from, many of them wanted to be called black king.
Mm-hmm.
So I think Rhode Island, they were called black governors.
Mm-hmm.
Massachusetts was called black king. And because Massachusetts and New Hampshire were all one part at one time,
Mm-hmm.
when they separated, they also went with the king name.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So once they were elected, they won, there would be a coronation. That's where the parade portion comes in.
Oh.
The parade was welcoming, inviting, and bringing to the public this king who won. And often many of the men who did not win would become part of the king's court because
Okay.
they wanted that to remain royal.
Yeah.
So after they had this celebration, which went from a coronation, which was part of the parade, to the festival, which would go on all day, all night, having fun, dancing, music. This is where they also introduced the banjo, and they introduced the drum, and they introduced the fife as part of their celebration. And this celebration was also a part of a custom that they brought over here from Africa. So go ahead.
No. I was going to say that what's fascinating is that that these are people who were running for king, or maybe in some cases governor, but in their homelands that had been stolen from, they had an hereditary title of king or prince. But when they came to this country, it's an interesting kind of transformation or transition, because then they become, through a democratic system, they are then elected to this position rather than acquiring it through a hereditary succession, which I think is just fascinating.
But they were also elevated up a level from a typical enslaved African. And they were also elevated up from a freeman because they had a status that gave them certain rights as a royal.
Wow. Okay. And then, so it's a great visual image that you create of them standing in a line, and then people who are in effect voting for them gather behind them, and visually you'd be able to tell who would won that election because they'd have the most people behind them. And then the parade, which is part of today's Negro Election Day celebration, that's how it began. It was a coronation parade and a huge party, if I'm understanding you, with music and dancing. So quite a festivity.
So now after this celebration was all over, then they would have to do the work. And the work meant they were a liaison between the white slave owner and the enslaved or freeman community. Because even though people were freemen, they still had an existence of servitude. Because they didn't have the freedom to get on in today's day and age, they didn't have the freedom to get on the Amtrak and go to New York or go to Washington. They were brought here. So basically then what they would do is they would govern, because they could serve as a judge. So they were punishing. They served as a sheriff. They went into their communities, into the churches, into the communities, and basically they would make sure that their people were taken care of. Even if it meant punishing them, there still was a difference in how a white slave owner would punish and how an enslaved of royal blood or a freeman of royal blood would punish.
Can you give an example of what some of those differences would have been in the way?
Well, logically speaking, we know that even in Massachusetts or even in the New England colonies, we know from articles and stories that we have been gathering over the years, there were still people who were tied to a tree and they
Yeah.
were whipped fiercely.
Yeah.
Um, that was not done.
Mhm.
What these judges and sheriffs would do is they would have a jail that was
Mm.
strictly for enslaved or free Black men, and they would jail them. And that kept them safe, even though
Mm.
that may seem or appear cruel, it still kept them safe because they weren't being abused or beaten or tied to trees and lynched and hung.
Yeah, and well, that's really fascinating, Doreen, because it sounds so, if I'm understanding you, it was like a parallel justice system and law enforcement system operating um, not exactly independently, but within the overarching domain of white quote unquote justice or white kind of punishment. And it was, from what you're saying, it was more, although people were punished, it was a much more humane punishment, being in jail,
Exactly.
for example, rather than being tortured.
Exactly.
Yeah. And so that was phenomenally important then. And a real way that these elected kings could advance the well-being of the people that they represented. Have I understood
Yes.
you?
You are
Yeah.
you are on the mark.
Yeah.
What I've recently found out, which is extremely interesting, is all this was approved by the Massachusetts General Court
Mm-hmm.
once they signed it into law.
Mm.
But it was funny because at some point, people felt that the enslaved Africans and the freemen were getting too powerful.
Oh.
So that's when in 1863, the General Massachusetts Court started going into different sections and different areas and saying, no, it has to stop. You're getting too powerful.
Mm.
We don't want you collaborating with us because what a lot of people don't know is when it was celebrated on the Boston Common in Boston, Mass, whites and blacks marched in the parade together. There's even a poem that was written to describe, that was described by a white man, what he saw during, at that time, they called it Election Day.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but then when it separated and blacks were no longer allowed to march in the parade on the Boston Common, then it went into Negro Election Day separately
Mm-hmm.
from the election day, and even the ancient and honorable artillery company. They even separated themselves in 1831 from
Mm.
being part of the parade, and they changed the date of their election day to they moved it from May to June
Oh,
because
interesting.
we know it as the third Saturday in July. But
Yeah.
before it went through an evolution, it was actually all celebrated throughout the colonies in May.
Interesting. So, what happened was white people got nervous, it sounds like. It's such a sad old story. And decided we need segregation. It sounds as
Much still like what goes
yeah,
on
yeah. I mean,
today,
it is,
ironically,
it is,
yes.
yeah, ironically and sadly. But and so then there was a separation into Election Day
Yes.
and Negro Election Day, and there was segregation then that happened with how it was celebrated. It's fascinating to me, though, that it was at one point long ago actually integrated on Boston Common.
In the
Uh,
1600s, around
yeah,
1693, it was integrated on the Boston Common.
yeah. Which is just a little mind-boggling, given the way we think about early American history. Since none of us knew this history, since as has often happened, Black history gets neglected or ignored, and sadly sometimes erased. Just as you were describing when we began with Black Picnic continued, but the history and the significance of Negro Election Day was starting to not get erased, but get lost, I guess, in terms of a general, let's have a picnic, let's celebrate, if I'm understanding you.
Well, that's why I call my whole exhibit Unmasking of Negro Election Day because
Yeah.
it went through an evolution.
Yeah.
So basically what would happen is it started out being Negro Election Day.
Mm-hmm.
And then after the Civil War and supposedly giving blacks the right to vote, which they still didn't have, they maintained this day as Emancipation Day, and they had political conventions.
Okay.
Then, after the complete merging of the races, then it was taken over and maintained by the community.
Mm-hmm.
So that shift went from we elected our protectors,
Yeah.
our leaders,
Mm-hmm.
to we're gathering in a place and we're getting together as a people united. That's when it went from Maid's picnic to church picnic to Sunday picnic.
Mm-hmm.
And then during the civil rights movement, and we became known as Black.
Mm-hmm.
Then it became the Black picnic.
Mm-hmm.
But in really unmasking this history and showing and proving what it is,
Mm-hmm.
then I began to realize that it needs to have its significance.
Yeah.
It has no value just being labeled a picnic.
Yeah.
And with people not understanding what the history is, it wasn't just a matter of changing its name. It had to be taught.
Yes, absolutely. Well, and that's the function of what you have instigated with Salem United then, which is wonderful, because it's such a fascinating and I have to say very inspiring story. And it expands the mind to think about these chapters of history that just we've been ignorant of, so I think it's wonderful. I'm really glad you started Salem United and you brought this back. I'm curious to find out, now in 1870, the 15th Amendment to the Constitution was passed, which gave African-American men the right to vote. How did that affect Negro Election Day and how it was celebrated?
Well, as I said a few minutes ago, it sent Negro Election Day through an evolution.
Mm-hmm.
And that evolution was adjusting our life with the times.
Mm-hmm.
And by adjusting our life with the times, we lost the value and the significance of this very important legacy.
Yeah.
And we didn't even realize, most people believed that you went to Salem Willows Park and you had this gathering. Most people didn't even understand that it was celebrated in Danvers, and Danvers had a ball along with their festival. It was celebrated in Marblehead, and Marblehead, I think Black Joe's Tavern is still there. And I know there was something not too long ago where they wanted to change the name of the pond that was named after him, that was called Black Joe Pond, not realizing the significance of what Black Joe represented. It represented him as serving as a Black governor in his own tavern, which he purchased and owned and celebrated Negro Election Day in there. So, and then of course, going across where it was celebrated in New Hampshire by King Nero, who was once ran against Pompey.
Oh, okay.
So I strive to make sure that we call it them Black kings or Black governors. As well, I just learned of an unbelievable history where Black King Dick used Negro Election Day during the War of 1812 to protect the prisoners in a prison called Dartmoor Prison in Great Britain. And they actually have that history in their museum. And when you look up the prison, they actually talk about the segregated section of that prison, which was once segregated, but then was desegregated because Black King Dick used his knowledge of Negro Election Day to protect not only the Black POWs, but the white POWs.
Oh, that's fascinating.
So there is an unbelievable history with it not just being in this country, but
Yeah.
crossing the waters and
Right.
then crossing back because he went back to celebrating it on the Boston Common again.
Doreen, you're going to have to write a book. Have you thought of doing that? Because it's an
I am actually in the process of
oh,
working
yay.
on the book.
Good.
And I'm also in the process of looking for a building, and I'm working with the hopefully with the Cambridge Gallery and Mall in
Oh,
Cambridge to put this exhibit up for a couple of years, especially during this time when we're getting ready to celebrate the
mhm.
country's history.
That's
This
right.
needs to be a part of it.
It absolutely. They're just extraordinary, wonderful, and amazing stories. Um, well, you know, tell us about because Negro Election Day is coming up July 20th. It's second time. It'll be a Massachusetts state holiday officially
Yes.
in Salem Willows Park. Tell us if people want to go down to Salem Willows Park, what can they look forward to on Negro Election Day this year?
Well, what our celebration consists of is we maintain the traditions of every generation and how they honored Negro Election Day. So we actually have the parade, and that's significant. That signifies the king.
Yeah.
We also have the festival that goes on. And so we have live music, we have vendors, we have a kids' corner, we have everything that you can imagine, live entertainment, games, because we are using this day to register people to vote.
Oh,
We're
great.
using this day to show equality, to
Hmm.
show unity, and we express very carefully that just because we put the original name Negro Election Day back,
Hmm.
it is a day for everyone
Hmm.
because this is a history that affected every human being's ancestor, not just enslaved Africans, but
Right.
all of us from indigenous to whatever. And those issues that were before are today. So we
Hmm.
tell people to come out, march in the parade, join the parade. It's at 12 o'clock on
Hmm.
the 20th. It starts at Shetland Park and it goes down to where its roots are, which is Salem Willows.
Wonderful.
Um, and then after the parade, I tell everybody stay for the festival. We have a wonderful time where this year we are honoring our military,
Hmm.
and we have a flag that has been flown over the US Capitol that will fly in Salem
Oh,
Willows, and then we are donating it, and we don't want to tell you who we're giving it to, presenting it to, because we want that to be a surprise on that.
okay. Fair
But
enough.
that's a part of what we still
Hmm.
do. We
Hmm.
honor our community.
Hmm.
We give out awards. We have speakers. Whatever people feel, we invite them every year to come and just join us.
Well, it sounds wonderful, Doreen. Absolutely wonderful. Like a festival in the tradition of the long-standing festival. You know, I did want to ask you as we finish up. We've talked somewhat about the legacy of Negro Election Day, but I'd like to ask you this question because I know it's something you've thought about a lot. Why is it important for all of us, to know about this chapter in American history and for it to be taught to children?
It's and you know it's funny because I am lecturing and I am teaching young people this history now. I go across the country and I'll talk to any young person that will tell me. And they ask me the same question. And I tell them because this day is about pride, freedom, and resilience.
Hmm.
Young people cannot have pride if they don't understand their history. If they sit and they listen that everybody else's history was more valuable than theirs,
Hmm.
then they have no pride. They have nothing to
Hmm.
look forward to. And if we have two children sitting in a room, one happens to be black, one happens to be white, and together they are learning this history, and they are learning that at some point their ancestors worked together.
Yeah.
That's going to make them leave that room and work together and be proud of each other's history. It says it's not the typical you were a savage running around the woods and the jungles, and the white man came along and saved you. It's not that. And so young people of all races and colors are not going to look at each other in a negative way. They're going to say, wow, everybody has value, and that's what I want to teach.
So it fosters mutual respect, mutual understanding, and also it just expands the accuracy of the history. And I think it's really important that we learn the truth, because we'll never grow as human beings, as a form of government, as a nation, if we don't know the full truth, the whole truth. So that was beautifully put, Doreen.
Well,
there are still
people today who believe that Negro Election Day is just for Black people.
Yeah.
And that's one of the reasons why it's very valuable to teach this, because it teaches you that in 1693, no, they marched together.
Yeah.
So everybody should be coming down and enjoying this day and enjoying this history.
And the other thing that, as we've been talking about, that we talked about this a little near the beginning, but it strikes me as important and transformative is to understand that in Negro Election Day, from its very beginning, was the foundation of a democratic system that honored the rights of the governed to elect their leaders, to choose. And it's through the consent of the governed, that fundamental kind of principle of American democracy, that power arises, that responsibility arises. So it's just such a remarkable story, Doreen. I can't thank you enough for taking time to do this. I'm so glad to have, I feel privileged to have learned more about it from you. Sorry,
and
what were you going to say?
Even in this little bit of history that I'm teaching, I like what you just said, because people walk away with, wow, my voice was important back then, and it's important now.
Right.
And we can stop feeling like if we don't get out and vote, it doesn't matter. Yes, it does matter in a democratic system, because every vote is important.
It's always mattered. So thank you, Doreen. And anybody wants more information about Salem United and Negro Election Day, you have a website. It is easy to remember. It's Salem United Inc. inc.org, SalemUnitedInc.org, and there's plenty of information there about Salem United, about the history of Negro Election Day. So Doreen, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I'm just so grateful that you started Salem United and you've unmasked this history for us all. Thank you.
Well, thank you for allowing me to be here, because, you know, as a fifth generation granddaughter of a member of the 54th Massachusetts Infantry, history is very important to me.
Sure.
So, and I want it to be told truthfully and honestly, and you giving me this opportunity to do that is just helping me with my mission and my goal. And I am honored and blessed to have people like you who open up your doors for me.
Anytime, all the time, Doreen. It's a pleasure and an honor. And you keep me posted about that book, all right?
I promise I will. And you will get a signed copy once it's written.
You come back on the show and we'll talk about it. Thank you so much, Doreen. You take care now.
Bye-bye.
That's it for today, really. Please join us again next Thursday at 9 for the morning show. Till then, everybody, be well.